There is a belief, quiet and persistent, that the grandest moments in history belong to the people who wear the crowns. We imagine royal weddings as events suspended in gold and ceremony, as if they materialized fully formed from some divine order. The cathedral prepared, the guests assembled, the bride already dressed in her embroidered gown, standing at the threshold of a life, arranged long before she understood what arrangement meant. We imagine that history was made in throne rooms, in chapels, in great halls lit by 1,000 candles, and this is not entirely wrong, but it is, in the most important way, incomplete. Because before any of that could happen, before the bishop took his place at the altar, before the trumpets announced the procession, before the nobles adjusted their velvet sleeves, and the ladies in waiting smoothed the folds of their mistress's train, there was a night. A long, particular, unhurried night that belonged not to kings and queens, but to the people who served them, the people who slept in straw, the people who rose before the sun had any thought of rising, the people whose names were never written down. Tonight we're going to spend that night in the stables. Not the great hall, not the royal bedchamber, not the chapel dressed in white flowers and ribbons of silk. We are going to sit quietly in the place where the horses breathe, where the lantern light flickers against old stone, where a boy of perhaps 13 summers has not yet been to sleep because there is too much to do, and because the world, his small particular world, is moving faster than it usually does, and he is trying to understand what that means. His name, if we could know it, might have been something simple. Thomas, William, Edmund. Names that appear and disappear in the historical record like stones dropped into water, leaving ripples that close almost immediately. He would have been the son of someone who also worked in the stables, or perhaps the son of a villager who sent him to castle service at the age of 7 or 8, as was entirely common in the medieval period. Children of the lower orders entered service young. It was not considered cruel. It was considered practical. It was considered good fortune. By the time he was 13, he would have known the stables as well as he knew his own hands. Better, perhaps, because in the medieval world, the body was a working instrument and you did not spend much time contemplating it. You used it. The stables, by contrast, were a landscape he had mapped with extraordinary precision. The particular way the third stall door needed to be lifted slightly before it would close, the smell of the corner where the hay was stored against the outer wall, the sound that meant a horse was merely restless, versus the sound that meant something was genuinely wrong. On the night before a royal wedding, none of that knowledge would be enough, because the stables would be full in a way they almost never were. Let's think about what that meant in practical terms. A medieval royal castle did not exist in isolation. It was the centre of a network of obligation, loyalty and attendance. When a royal wedding were announced, and such announcements came with considerable lead time because the logistics involved were extraordinary, every lord, every baron, every knight of significance within a reasonable distance would have received word that his presence was expected. Expected was a careful word. It meant required. It meant that failure to attend was a statement, and statements had consequences. These men did not travel alone. A lord of middling rank in the medieval period would travel with a retinue. The word retinue comes from the French retenir, meaning to retain, to hold back, to keep. A retinue is the visible evidence of your power. The number of horses, servants, armed men, and attendants you could afford to bring with you was a direct expression of your standing. To arrive with fewer people than your rank suggested was an embarrassment. To arrive with more than your rank justified was provocation. There was an entire social grammar to the size of a retinue, and everyone at court could read it fluently. Each of those horses needed somewhere to sleep. The castle's own stables had a fixed capacity. They were built to accommodate the horses of the household, the horses of the knights in regular residence, the horses used for hunting and for carrying messages. On ordinary days, the stables ran at something like their designed capacity. On the night before a major royal event, they were required to absorb a number of animals that might be 3 or 4 times that. The stable boy would have been working since before noon. The arrival of the guests was itself an event spread across hours. The greatest lords, those whose rank required that they be given precedence in everything, might arrive with elaborate ceremony, their approach announced by scouts, their entry through the castle gates marked by the sound of horses and the creaking of the wagon wheels, and the low murmur of a large body of people moving together. Lesser lord arrived with less ceremony, but equal numbers of animals. Servants arrived last, or travelled separately, or filtered in through the kitchen entrance and the lesser gates, carrying boxes and chests and rolled bundles of clothing that would be unpacked and ironed and hung in the rooms assigned to their masters. Throughout all of this, horses needed to be received. The receiving of a horse was a specific skill. You did not simply take an animal from a rider and put it somewhere. A horse that had been travelling for several hours was a different animal from a horse at rest. It would warm from exertion. Its muscles needed to cool slowly, or it would stiffen in ways that were painful and potentially damaging. It needed water, but not too much water too quickly, because a horse that drank heavily while still warm could develop colic, an internal distress that was in the medieval period frequently fatal. It needed to be walked at a slow, steady pace for a period of time that depended on how far it had come and how hard it had been ridden. After it had been walked and had begun to cool, it needed to be rubbed down. The rubbing down of a horse was not a perfunctory gesture. It was a careful process of removing sweat and road dust from the coat, of checking the legs for heat, or swelling that might indicate strain, of examining the hooves for stones or damage. A horse that arrived with a stone lodged in its hoof and was not checked immediately might develop a bruise that will make it lame by morning, which would be an embarrassing problem for its owner, an uncomfortable problem for everyone in the stables who had failed to notice. The stable boy knew all of this. He had been trained in all of this. He had been practicing these skills since he was perhaps 9 years old, when his hands were too small to hold a curry comb properly, and his reach was too short to groom a tall horse without standing on something. Now, at 13, he was efficient. He was fast. He was not fast enough, because the horses kept coming. This is one of the things that does not survive in the historical record. The sheer physical volume of the medieval world at moments of ceremony. We have accounts of royal weddings that describe the procession, the vows, the feasts, the gifts, the music. We have almost no accounts that describe the stables the night before, because the people who kept records were the people who attended banquets, not the people who mucked out stalls. The servants, the stable hands, the grooms, the boys who carried buckets and spread straw and checked hay supplies, they appear in the historical record, if at all, as background, as infrastructure, as the invisible machinery that made the visible ceremony possible. But they were there, and the night before a royal wedding, they were working. Let us stay with the stable boy for a moment and think about what his body knew. He was tired in the way that children who do physical labour are tired, a tiredness that is not like the tiredness of adults, which can become a kind of heaviness, a weight that presses down. Children's tiredness in the medieval period was more like a wavering. The energy came and went. He would move quickly for a while and then slow. Not because he chose to slow, but because his body simply reduced its speed. And then something would happen. A horse would move suddenly, or someone would call his name, or the smell of food from the kitchen carried across the courtyard on the night air. And the energy would return, sudden and surprising, and he would move quickly again. He had eaten, but not well, and not recently enough. The kitchen during the preparations for a royal wedding was a place of organised chaos. The cooks who normally managed the daily rhythm of the castle's meals were now operating under extraordinary pressure. A royal wedding feast required preparation that had been ongoing for days. The salting and smoking of meats, the grinding of spices, the preparation of pies and pastries, and the various elaborate constructions of sugar and marzipan that decorated the pie table. The bread alone represented an extraordinary quantity of work. A royal feast might require hundreds of loaves, each one needing to be mixed, proved, shaped, and baked in the castle's great ovens. The servants who brought food to the stables during this period got what was left over, what was available, what could be spared without disrupting the calculations of the head cook, who was managing a complex supply chain with the intensity of a military commander. The stable boy would have eaten bread. He might have had a piece of salt fish or a bowl of pottage, a thick soup of grains and whatever vegetables were available, seasoned with herbs, filling in the way that things are filling when they are the only thing available, and you are hungry enough not to care about anything else. He would not have eaten meat. Meat at a castle in the days before a royal feast was being carefully hoarded, weighed, accounted for. The idea of a stable boy eating a piece of roasted chicken the night before the wedding feast would have struck everyone in the castle as faintly absurd. He drank water, or perhaps weak ale. The ale was safer. Water sources in the medieval period were unreliable, and even people who didn't know the word bacteria understood from accumulated experience that drinking from certain sources made you sick. Ale, which was brewed with heat, was generally safer, and in a working environment like a castle, it was consumed by servants and workers throughout the day as a matter of course. This was not intoxication. This was hydration. The ale available to servants was weak enough that you could drink considerable quantities of it without any noticeable effect beyond the intake of liquid. He slept in the stables. This is worth pausing on because it is one of those facts about medieval life that can sound harsh from a modern perspective and was simply ordinary from a medieval one. The stable boy did not have a room. He did not have a bed in the modern sense. A private space defined by walls, a door, a mattress filled with something soft. He had a place in the stables where the straw was thicker, where the angle of the wall blocked the worst of the draughts, where he had perhaps arranged a folded sack to put under his head. He slept near the animals he tended because proximity was practical, because horses could be disturbed in the night and someone needed to be there, because the warmth of the animals was not nothing when the stone walls of a medieval castle held the cold the way stone holds cold, which is to say completely and without apology. Sleeping with animals was not stigmatized. It was not a mark of poverty in the way we might instinctively read it now. The world of the medieval castle was a world of bodies, human and animal, in much closer proximity than we are accustomed to. The great hall of a castle might, on an ordinary night, contain sleeping servants on the floor after the trestle tables were cleared. The chamber of a lord might contain not only the lord and his lady, but several attendants who slept on pallets, near the door or across the threshold. Privacy in the modern sense was a luxury available only to those of the very highest rank, and even then it was an incomplete privacy, always attended, always supervised. The boy slept where he was, and he slept when he could, and on the night before a royal wedding, when he could was not yet. Think about the horses themselves for a moment. The medieval horse was not one kind of animal. It was several kinds, each with a different purpose, each with different requirements, each occupying a different position in the social hierarchy of the stable. At the top of that hierarchy was the destrier, the great war horse, the animal trained for battle, built for strength and endurance under the weight of an armoured rider. A destrier was extraordinarily valuable. The cost of a good destrier could equal the annual income of a prosperous knight, which meant that the people who owned them were people who could afford to lose such a sum if the animal died, but who would prefer not to, and who therefore expected their horses to be cared for with a precision that bordered on the anxious. A destrier arriving at the castle for a royal wedding was not an ordinary horse. It was an investment, a symbol, a statement of its owner's military capability and social standing. It would be stabled in the best available space, given the best available feed, and tended with the most careful attention. Below the destrier in status, but equal in their claims on attention, were the palfreys, lighter horses bred for riding, for the long journeys between estates, for the kind of travel that required smoothness and endurance rather than raw power. Ladies rode palfreys. Palfreys were trained to a particular gait, an ambling 4-beat pace that reduced the jolting experienced by a rider, which was important when the rider was wearing elaborate clothing that could not be crumpled, or when the rider was a woman whose social position meant that arriving dishevelled was not acceptable. Then there were the cart horses and pack horses, the animals that carried the baggage, the animals that pulled the wagons loaded with chests of clothing and gifts and supplies. These were not glamorous animals, they were working animals, and they were treated like working animals, which in the medieval period meant that they were given reasonable feed and rest, because an exhausted or injured pack horse was a problem for the person who owned it, not because anyone was particularly sentimental about them. And then there were the hunting horses, the coursers, the animals used for the hunt that would almost certainly be organised as part of the wedding celebrations. Hunting was not merely entertainment in the medieval period. It was training for war. It required skill and courage and physical conditioning. A noble who did not hunt was a noble who was, in some fundamental way, not performing his role correctly. The stable boy knew all of these animals and what they needed. He knew them the way you know things that you have learned, not from books, because he had no books, and if he had had books he would not have been able to read them, but from experience, from watching, from the corrections of older grooms who showed him what to do and hit him, occasionally when he did it wrong, not from cruelty but from the pedagogy of the working world, which understood that some lessons needed to be sharp to be remembered. Outside the stables the castle was alive in ways it was not usually alive at this hour. Let us walk out through the stable door for a moment and stand in the courtyard. The courtyard of a medieval castle was not a quiet place even on ordinary nights. There were always sounds, the movement of guards on the walls, the distant noise of the kitchen if cooking continued late, the occasional voice calling across the darkness for a specific purpose. Sound carried differently in stone environments. It bounced off walls and returned changed, so that a shout from across the courtyard arrived at your ears as something flattened and strange, as if the stone had taken something out of it. But on the night before a royal wedding, the courtyard was different. There were lights that were not usually there. Torches set in additional brackets, lanterns carried by servants moving between buildings. The castle's ordinary darkness was interrupted by these points of light that moved and stayed and moved again, creating a shifting, incomplete illumination. The great hall had been decorated during the day. Rushes on the floor had been replaced with fresh ones, scented with herbs, mint and sweet rush and meadow sweet, plants chosen for their ability to release fragrance when walked upon, to counter the smell of the bodies that would fill the space, the smell of food and wine, and the particular animal warmth of a large number of people gathered in an enclosed space. Hangings had been brought out of storage, lengths of woven fabric in colours that were expensive enough to be worth keeping, deep red, the dark green of summer forests, the faded blue of the best dyed wool, and hung on the walls to reduce the cold that came off the stone and to transform the appearance of the hall from a space of daily use into something that declared, visually and without ambiguity, that something significant was happening. The flowers were being arranged. This is a detail that most histories pass over, but it is worth staying with for a moment. The decoration of a medieval castle for a royal wedding involved enormous quantities of plant material, flowers, greenery, herbs, branches. All of it needed to be collected, transported and arranged within a window of time that balanced the need for freshness against the practical realities of a medieval supply chain. Flowers cut too early would wilt before the ceremony. Flowers cut too late might not be available in the right quantities. The people doing this work were primarily women. In the medieval household, the management of herbs and flowers was understood to fall within the sphere of female knowledge and female labour. The great ladies of the castle might supervise, but the actual physical work of gathering and arranging was done by the women who served them. The ladies-in-waiting, the chambermaids, the laundresses who knew which plants could be used to scent fabrics. And on the night before a royal wedding, some of these women would have been working by lamplight, arranging sprays of greenery and flowers in the spaces where the great lord and his guests would gather, working with the kind of quiet, concentrated attention that invisible labour requires. The stable boy would have seen them if he crossed the courtyard. He would have seen the light from the hop windows, the movement of figures within. He would not have given them much thought, except perhaps to notice that the castle smelled different tonight, that the scent of cut flowers and herbs was stronger than usual, that it competed with the smell of smoke and horses and the residual smell of old food that was simply part of the atmospheric texture of a working medieval castle. He had a bucket to refill. Let us think about water for a moment, because water in a medieval castle was a significant logistical concern that appears almost nowhere in popular accounts of medieval life. The castle had a well. The well was the primary water source for the entire establishment, for cooking, for washing, for drinking, for the horses, for everything. The well was located in the courtyard, and it was operated by a windlass, a simple mechanical device that allowed a rope attached to a bucket to be lowered and raised. The mechanism was not complicated, but it required physical effort, and the effort required scaled directly with the number of trips to the well that needed to be made. On an ordinary day, the stable boy might make a fixed number of trips to the well. He knew how much water the horses in his care needed, and he could plan his trips accordingly. On the night before a royal wedding, with the stables at 3 or 4 times their usual capacity, the number of trips to the well had increased by a corresponding amount. Each trip required the unwinding of the rope, the lowering of the bucket, the waiting for the bucket to fill, the raising of the bucket, which when full of water was heavier than you expected it to be if you had not done this work and thought about it abstractly, the carrying of the bucket across the courtyard to the stables. He had made this trip many times tonight. He would make it several more times before the night was over. The well in winter and medieval English winters were not mild, were not the managed cold of a heated building, were the cold of stone and wind and insufficient clothing. The well in winter was a different experience from the well in summer. The rope was sometimes stiff with cold. The metal fittings of the windlass were cold enough to ache against the palms of a boy's hands, and the courtyard between the well and the stables was exposed to whatever wind was moving, which in winter was the kind of wind that found the gaps in your clothing and investigated them with a thoroughness that felt personal. He wore what he had. He had a tunic of undyed wool, likely rough to the touch, not the rough of something that has been worn too long, but the rough of something that was always rough, that is made from the kind of wool that went to the people who could not afford anything better. He might have had a shorter garment over that, a tabard or a vest of heavier fabric. His feet were in leather shoes that were not boots, shoes that would not keep out the wet if the ground were damp, which the ground of the courtyard would be, because the passage of so many horses and people during the day had churned the packed earth into something that held moisture. His hands were cold. This is a small detail, but it is worth holding on to, because it is one of those details that connects the abstract historical world to the actual physical experience of being a person in that world. When we read about medieval servants, we read about them at a remove, as functions rather than bodies. The groom who tended the horses, the boy who drew the water. We do not usually read about cold hands, but the cold hands were real. They were part of the experience. They were what it actually felt like to be in that courtyard, on that night, doing that work. Inside the castle proper, in the rooms assigned to the highest-ranking guests, things were warmer. The heating of a medieval castle was a constant preoccupation. Stone, as we have already observed, is a material that holds cold rather than heat, and the great rooms of a castle in winter were heated primarily by fireplaces, large fireplaces in the great halls that could accept logs of earths that required 2 men to carry, and smaller fireplaces in the private chambers of the most important occupants. The guests who had arrived for the wedding were distributed through these chambers according to a hierarchy so precise and so understood by everyone involved that it required almost no explanation. The highest-ranking lords had the chambers closest to the family's own quarters, chambers with larger fireplaces and better hangings, and beds that were made up with the best available linens. Lesser lords were in lesser chambers, further from the centre, with smaller fireplaces and fewer attendants assigned to them. The servants of these lords were somewhere further again, in corridors and galleries, in the spaces between spaces that a working castle always contained. The bed, in the chamber of an important guest, was itself a significant object. In the modern period, we tend to think of a bed as a piece of furniture, something that exists to support the human body during sleep. In the medieval period, the bed was considerably more than this. It was a social object, a political object, an object of display and of meaning. The most important beds in a castle were tall, canopied structures with fabric hangings on all 4 sides that could be drawn closed, creating a small enclosed space that was simultaneously private, warm, and a visual statement about the importance of the person sleeping within it. The fabric of these hangings was expensive. The cost of the hangings on an important lord's bed might exceed the cost of the frame beneath them. The embroidery that decorated the best of these pieces represented hundreds of hours of skilled female labour, the ladies of the household and their attendants working with needle and thread to produce decorative work that was, in the medieval understanding of things, both beautiful and functional, a demonstration of the household's wealth and the women's skill. Setting up such a bed in a guest chamber was a task that fell to specific servants, under the supervision of the household's chamberlain, and it needed to be done correctly, because the lord who arrived to find his bed poorly made, the hangings not properly hung, the pillows not arranged according to convention, the linens not sufficiently fresh, would notice and would remember, and the memory would reflect on the household that had received him. The stable boy did not sleep in anything like this. He slept in straw, as we have noted, near the animals he tended, in the smell of horse and hay, and the particular organic warmth that a stable produces, a warmth that is real, that is not nothing, that was in fact relied upon by the people who slept in stables in winter, not as a luxury, but as a practical resource. The body heat of horses is substantial. A stable full of horses on a winter night is meaningfully warmer than the courtyard outside it, and meaningfully warmer than certain other parts of the castle where the fires were smaller or less carefully tended. He was not unhappy in his straw. This is important to say, and important to say carefully, because there is a temptation, when looking at the material conditions of medieval servant life from the perspective of the 21st century, to project onto those lives a misery that may not have been the dominant experience. The stable boy existed in a world whose parameters were completely different from ours. He did not compare his sleeping situation to the sleeping situations of people in other parts of the castle, except in the most abstract way. The way you might acknowledge that some people have things you do not have without that acknowledgement generating active suffering. He compared his situation to the situations of other stable boys, other servants, other people whose lives were recognisably similar to his. And within that comparison, he was not doing badly. He had work, which was security. He had a place to sleep, which was more than some people had. He had enough to eat most of the time, which in a world where harvest failures were a regular occurrence and genuine hunger was not a historical abstraction, but an annual possibility was not a trivial thing. He was part of a household, which meant he was part of a web of obligation and protection that, however limited by modern standards, was better than having no such web. He was, by the measures available to him, all right. The night continued. One of the things that the historical record captures poorly, because the historical record is made of documents, and documents are made by people who had particular reasons to write particular things down, is the texture of waiting. The stable boy's night was not continuous activity. There were gaps. There were moments when the horses were settled, when the bucket had been refilled, when the next task had not yet announced itself. In those moments he waited. What did he do in those moments? He might have watched the horses. There was a kind of watching that is not attention in the focused sense, not the watching of someone looking for something specific, but a loose, unfocused observation that allows the eye to rest on something without demanding anything of it. The horses in their stalls, standing or lying, their breath visible in the cold air of the stable, their small movements and adjustments, their occasional sounds. This was something to look at that asked nothing in return. It was, in a world with few diversions and no concept of entertainment as a category separate from work. Something. He might have dozed briefly, sitting against a wall with his knees drawn up and his chin dropping toward his chest, the way the very young do when they are tired. Not a full sleep, but a half sleep. A brief withdrawal from the weight of consciousness before some noise or sensation brought him back. He might have thought about the wedding. This is speculative, of course. We cannot know what he thought. But we know that tomorrow the world of the castle would be transformed into something it was not on ordinary days. He would have known this. He would have been aware in the way that people who are part of a large institution are aware of the institution's significant moments, that tomorrow mattered in a way that today did not. Did he wonder about the bride? In the medieval world, royal marriages were arranged. This is well known, but the knowing of it can become abstract unless we sit with what it actually meant in practice in the lives of the specific people involved. The bride of a royal wedding had likely known for years that she would be married to this particular person. The negotiation of royal marriages began, in many cases, when the parties involved were still children, when they were the age of the stable boy, or younger. The terms were set by fathers and advisers, by considerations of territory and alliance, and the complex politics of a world in which heredity was the primary mechanism of power transfer. The bride, on the night before her wedding, was somewhere in the castle. She was almost certainly not sleeping or not sleeping well. She was attended by her ladies, who would have maintained a careful watch over her mood and her needs, who would have brought her warm drinks and tried to settle her, who would have said the things that ladies-in-waiting said to high-born women in such circumstances, reassurances that varied in their sincerity depending on the particular relationship between the attendant and the lady she served. The stable-boy did not know her. She was not a person to him in the way that the horses were persons to him, or the other grooms, or the cook who sometimes gave him an extra heel of bread when the kitchen was generous. She was a figure at a remove, someone who existed in a different part of the castle's social geography, someone whose life was conducted in spaces he would never enter, someone whose story was too large and too formal to have anything to do with his own. And yet they shared the same night. They breathed the same cold air. They heard, distantly, the same sounds. The wind, if there was wind, the distant sound of the castle settling, the particular silence that a large building achieves when its daytime activity has slowed but not stopped. Let us think about sound for a moment, because sound at medieval castle is something we rarely consider, but something that would have been a constant particular experience for the people who lived there. Stone is a material that transmits sound in unexpected ways. A conversation held quietly in one part of a stone corridor can be heard with surprising clarity in another part, because the sound travels along the stone rather than dissipating into it. This made privacy, in the modern sense, very difficult to achieve. The castle was a place where voices carried, where footsteps announced themselves, where the sounds of human activity was constantly present and constantly audible. On the night before a royal wedding, the sounds of the castle were different from the ordinary sounds of a castle night. There was more movement in the corridors, servants going about tasks that could only be completed now, when the daytime activity had cleared enough space for them. There were conversations that happened in low voices but carried nonetheless. The consultation between the chamberlain and the head cook about the arrangements for the morning, the discussion between the guards about who was covering which watch, the quieter and more personal conversations between servants who found themselves awake together in the unusual intimacy of a shared night. From the kitchen, which never fully slept during preparations of this scale, there were sounds of fire, of pots, of the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of bread dough being worked. The kitchen fires of a medieval castle were never truly extinguished during a feast period. They were maintained at lower levels through the night so that they could be brought back to full intensity in the morning without the delay of building a fire from cold ashes. Someone was always awake in the kitchen. Someone was always watching the fire. From the stables, the sounds were animal sounds. Horses moving in their stalls, the occasional sound of hooves on stone, the breathing that was different from the breathing of sleeping horses. Deeper, slower, a sound that implied a kind of settled unconsciousness that the stable boy, on this particular night, could not quite achieve himself. He was awake at the hour when most of the castle slept. What was that hour? In the medieval reckoning of time, the night was not divided into the equal hours we are accustomed to. The canonical hours, the schedule of prayers that ordered the day in a monastic and by extension in a broader medieval Christian context, divided the day and night into periods that varied in length depending on the season, because they were calculated from sunrise and sunset, which changed throughout the year. The hour of matins, the night office, fell deep in the night. Lauds came before dawn. Prime mark the first hour of daylight. Between matins and lauds was a particular quality of darkness, not the first darkness of evening, not the preliminary darkness that preceded sleep, but the deepest darkness, the darkness that came after several hours of night had passed. The darkness that felt in some way more serious, more settled, more final than the darkness of 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. This was the hour the stable boy was awake in. He would not have called it 3 in the morning because the concept of 3 in the morning as a specific, named time was not available to him. He would have known it as deep night, as the night that was furthest from both the evening that preceded it and the dawn that would eventually follow. He would have known it from the quality of the darkness and the quality of the silence. A silence that was not absence of sound, but a specific texture of sound, the minimal sounds of a castle at its most dormant. A horse moved. He rose and checked it. The horse was of a palfrey, one of the guest horses, a mare of about 8 years, dark in the darkness of the stall, her eyes catching the weak light of the lantern he carried. She had been restless earlier in the evening, which he had noted. Restlessness in a horse is information. It means something, though what it means requires interpretation. It might mean discomfort or illness, or simply the anxiety of a strange place, a stall that smelled of other horses, a night that offered no familiar landmarks. He checked her feet first. The hooves were clean, no stones, no heat in the frog, the sensitive central structure of the hoof that is the first place to show the warmth of early inflammation. He ran his hands down each leg, feeling for swelling. Nothing. He checked her sides, his hand flat against her flank, feeling for the distension that would indicate gas accumulating in the gut. Nothing. He listened to her gut sounds, placed his ear against her side and listened for your rumbling, the ongoing internal conversation of a healthy digestive system. She was fine. She was simply in a strange place, on a strange night, in a castle full of unfamiliar horses. She wanted the reassurance of a known presence. He stood with her for a while, let her smell his hand, then his face. Spoke to her in low voice, not words that meant anything in particular, just sounds at a pitch and pace that horses find calming, the way you might talk to a child who is upset, not to communicate information, but to communicate presence, to say, without saying it in any language that could be written down, I'm here. Nothing is wrong. You can rest, she settled. He moved back to his place in the straw and sat against the wall. The night before a royal wedding was a night of preparation that had been ongoing for days, but it was also a night with a particular character that distinguished it from all the preparation days that had come before. All the days of grinding and salting and sewing and arranging were over. What remained now was the final night, the last night before the thing became real. In the morning, there would be noise from the moment the light began. The castle would wake in stages, first the kitchen, then the stables, then the servants' quarters, then the corridors where the guests were housed, then the higher rooms, then finally the rooms of the family themselves, where the routines of dressing and preparation would begin and would not stop until the procession to the chapel. The procession to the chapel was the moment the wedding became official, in the sense that it became witnessed, that it became a public fact rather than an arrangement. The vows spoken in the chapel and Latin in the presence of the priest, before witnesses of sufficient rank to give the vows legal weight, would bind two people together in a way that did not easily be undone. The Church's position on the indissolubility of marriage was clear, was enforced, was one of the significant ways in which the Church exerted its authority over even the most powerful secular rulers. The bride had known this for years, the groom had known this for years, and their families had known this. Everyone in the castle had known this. The stable boy, sitting in his straw in the hour before dawn, also knew this in the way he knew most things about the world above him, partially imprecisely from overheard conversations and the accumulated sense of how things worked, that comes from living in proximity to events without being part of them. What he knew more precisely was that in a few hours the castle would require his best work. The horses of the wedding party, the great horses that would carry the family in procession, the horses that would be visible, that would be observed by everyone gathered to witness, needed to be perfect. Their coats needed to shine, their manes needed to be braided in the particular style that the senior groom had shown him, a style that required patience and dexterity and a willingness to work slowly. Their hooves needed to be cleaned and, if there was oil available, polished to a dark gleam. He would need to be up before first light. First light in winter came late, but first light was not when the work began. The work began before first light, in the darkness that preceded dawn, which was a different darkness from the deep night darkness, lighter in some indefinable way, as if the darkness itself was preparing for what came next. He should have been sleeping. He was not sleeping. This is perhaps the most human detail of the night. The fact that despite the exhaustion of hours of physical labour, despite the necessity of sleep, the stable boy was awake. Not because he had tasks still to complete, not because some emergency required his attention, but simply because the night was the kind of night that resisted sleep. There was too much in the air, too much anticipation, too much strangeness, too much of the quality of something about to happen that the body recognizes and responds to by refusing to fully rest. He was 13 years old, and tomorrow was the most significant day the castle had seen in years, and he was awake in the deepest part of the night, sitting in straw, listening to horses breathe. Let us think about what he could see from where he was. The stable had several windows, not glass windows, which were expensive and reserved for the castle's most important spaces, but openings in the stone wall covered with wooden shutters that could be closed against the worst weather and open to allow air to circulate. Some of these shutters were slightly opened, not fully latched, which was not unusual. In a stable, ventilation was important, not merely for the comfort of the animals, but for their health. Through the gap in one of these shutters, the stable boy could see a slice of the courtyard. And in the courtyard, in the darkness that was beginning, very slowly to lighten at its furthest edges toward the east, there were things to see. A servant crossing with a torch. Not hurrying, but moving with the particular purposeful walk of someone who had a specific destination and a specific task. The torch cast a pool of moving light around the figure, orange and wavering, that moved with the person across the dark stone of the courtyard and disappeared around a corner. The wall above the gatehouse, where a guard stood watch. He could see the guard's silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, a still shape, patient, doing the thing that guards did on watch, which was to stand still and look outward, to be the castle's vigilance made flesh. The upper windows of the great hall, light from within, filtering through the gaps in the shutters. Not the bright light of a fully lit room, but the residual glow of fires banked for the night, warm and amber and steady. These were not dramatic things to see, but they were things. And the thing about the night before a significant event is that everything in the field of attention acquires a slightly heightened quality. The torch is brighter. The guard's silhouette is more distinct. The light from the hall windows seems to carry more meaning than it would on any other night. Tomorrow, those windows will be filled with music. The music of a medieval royal wedding was a significant production. The castle would have had its own musicians. Not necessarily musicians in the full professional sense, though some castles did maintain household musicians, but people with musical skills who were called upon for significant occasions, and for a royal wedding additional musicians would have been brought in, hired from the town, or invited from the retinues of the guests, or specifically commissioned. The instruments of the medieval period produced sounds that were different from the sounds we are accustomed to associating with formal music. The form, which was a predecessor of the modern oboe, had a penetrating, somewhat nasal quality. It was an instrument designed to be heard over crowds and across distances. An outdoor instrument, a street instrument that found its way into great halls because its volume made it practical. The lute, by contrast, was intimate, a soft instrument suitable for smaller rooms, for the space between people in conversation, for the accompaniment of a singer in a quiet moment. For a royal wedding, the music would have moved through different registers depending on the moment. The procession required music that announced, that declared, that said to everyone watching something significant is happening. Pay attention. The feast required music that accompanied eating and conversation, not silence, because silence in a feast hall was uncomfortable, and suggested that the host had failed to provide entertainment, but not music so loud or demanding that it prevented the business of the meal. And in the later hours of the celebration, when the dancing began, the music would change again, would take on the insistent rhythmic quality that dance music requires. The stable boy had probably heard music at celebrations before. Not royal music, not the professional musicians that would appear tomorrow. But in the village, at the festivals that punctuated the agricultural year, the celebrations of harvest, of planting, of the saints' days that were spread throughout the year, each with its own particular customs, there was music, simple instruments, a pipe, a drum, a fiddle played by someone whose skill was relative rather than absolute. Music that everyone present could dance to because the dances were simple and the music was clear. Royal music would be different, more complex, more formal, more disciplined. but the stable boy might not hear much of it, because the feast would be inside, and he would be outside, or at stables, doing the continuing work of caring for the animals whose owners were inside being celebrated. This was the shape of his relationship to the great event. He was adjacent to it, parallel to it, but not part of it. His work would make the event possible. The horses needed to be there, and they needed to be in their perfect condition, and that required his labour. But his labour was invisible in the way that all infrastructure is invisible, noticed only when it fails. This is one of the most persistent patterns in history. The people whose labour makes significant events possible are the least likely to be part of those events, or to be remembered in connection with them. The wedding feast would be described in chronicles as magnificent, as a demonstration of the family's wealth and power, as befitting the alliance being formed. The chronicles would describe the food, the music, the gifts, the notable guests. They would not describe the stable boy. They would not describe the women who decorated the hall, or the baker who had been working for 3 days on the bread, or the laundress who had washed and pressed the linens, or any of the hundreds of other people whose specific skilled labour had been required to produce the spectacle. This is not a complaint. It is an observation about how history works, about what history is, a selective record of the past by people who had particular reasons to record particular things, who were embedded in particular social structures that determined what was worth writing down. What is remarkable, if you sit quietly with this observation, is not that the stable boy was not recorded. It is that, despite not being recorded, he was there. He was real. The cold of the courtyard when he went to draw water. That cold was as real as the warmth of the feast hall. The ache in his hands after hours of work. That ache was as real as the finest embroidered hanging in the guest chamber. His watchful attention to the horses in his care was as real as the diplomatic calculations that had arranged this marriage. History tends to move vertically, from king to king, from treaty to treaty, from the decision of one powerful person to the decision of another. But life, at any given moment, is also horizontal, spread across all the people who share a particular time and place, each of them equally present, equally real, equally subject to the cold and the dark and the demands of their bodies and the texture of the long night. The stable boy sat in his horizontal reality and waited for the dawn. The dawn, in the medieval understanding, was not merely a change in light. It was theologically significant. The return of light after darkness carried associations that ran through the culture in ways that were not explicit but were pervasive. Light was associated with God, with truth, with the right order of things. The daily return of light was, at some level, a daily confirmation that the world continued to be what it was supposed to be. For the stable boy, the practical significance of the dawn was simpler and more immediate. The dawn meant that the work he needed to do before the wedding could begin, it meant that he would have light to work by, actual light, not the uncertain light of a single lantern in a large stable, but the spreading general light of the sky that made everything more visible and easier to manage. It meant that the night, with its particular quality of waiting, would be over. He pulled his knees to his chest and watched the slice of courtyard through the gap in the shutter. The sky was beginning to lighten, not quickly. The change was so gradual that it was difficult to say precisely when it began. There was a moment when the darkness was absolute, and then a later moment when it was clearly not absolute. But between those two moments was a long gradient of barely perceptible change. The stars nearest the horizon faded first, then those a little higher. The solid black of the sky became, at the east, a dark blue, then a lighter blue, then the beginning of something that was not yet colour, but was the preparation for colour. He rose before it was fully light. He went to the well. The courtyard was empty of other people. He was among the first of the servants as waker as he usually was. That was required by the nature of his work. The horses needed water and feed before the day began. Before any of the guests required their horses, before the procession could form, before the ceremony could take place, the animals needed to have been attended to. He lowered the bucket. The sound of it entering the water was a sound he had heard hundreds of times. The specific hollow sound of the bucket hitting the surface of the well water. Then the change in sound as it filled, then the weight as he drew it back up. His hands were cold. He carried the bucket to the stables. Behind him as he walked, the sky continued to lighten. In the guest chambers, the servants of the arriving lords were beginning to stir. The chamberlain's assistants were moving quietly through the corridors, checking that fires had been maintained through the night, that the rooms would be warm when their occupants woke. In the kitchen, the head cook was already at work directing the morning's preparations with the focused intensity of a person who has made many lists and checked them many times and is now in the process of executing them. In the bride's chamber, her ladies had been awake for some time. The dressing of a medieval bride on her wedding day was not a simple matter. It was a process and a lengthy one, and it required the participation of several people, each of them performing a specific role in the ritual of preparation that preceded the ceremony. The bride's clothing had been prepared and pressed and arranged. Her hair needed to be done in the style appropriate to a woman about to be married, different from the style of an unmarried girl, different from the style of a widow, specific to this particular transitional moment. The ladies worked in the lamplight that was now being supplemented by the first grey light of the winter morning. They worked carefully, because this was careful work that required attention and patience, and the accumulated skill of women who had spent their lives in the management of clothing and hair, and the physical presentation of high-born women. They spoke to the bride in low voices, the way you speak to someone who is managing something difficult and needs your support without needing your noise. The bride sat still and allowed herself to be prepared. In the stables, the horses were being brushed. The stable boy worked with the methodical attention that good work required. The coat of the wedding horse, the great horse that would carry the groom in procession, needed to shine. Shining required time, required the repeated passage of the brush in long strokes along the direction of the hair growth, required the application of a cloth for the final polish, required patience. He had braided the mane the previous evening, but the braids had come slightly loose in the night, as things do when they are left unattended, and he rebraided them now, working quickly and neatly, his fingers knowing the pattern without needing his mind to think about it. The horse stood quietly. Outside, the courtyard was coming to life. More servants were appearing, figures moving with purpose across the stone, carrying things, heading toward the kitchen or the hall or the chambers of the guests. The quality of the morning activity was different from ordinary morning activity. Faster, more concentrated, the particular heightened energy of a day that mattered. The bells of the castle chapel rang for prime. This sound of the bells moved through the stone of the castle the way sound moves through stone, directly without loss, arriving in the stable with a clarity that outdoor bells sometimes lack. 6 rings and then silence. And the silence after bells is a particular kind of silence, a silence that has been shaped by what preceded it, a silence that still carries the memory of the sound. The stable boy looked up at the sound. He was at 13 at an age when the world was not yet entirely familiar, when it still had the capacity to seem occasionally larger and stranger and more significant than ordinary. He had been in this castle his whole conscious life, or something close to it. He knew its corridors and its courtyards and its rhythms and its rules. He knew where things were and how they worked and what was expected of him. But this morning was not an ordinary morning, and even he, embedded in his straw and his work and his small particular knowledge, could feel that. Today, something would happen that would change things. Not his things, probably. Not the things that directly concerned him, the horses, the straw, the bucket, the cold hands at the well. But in the world above him, in the world of the people whose names would be remembered, something was going to be made permanent. Two people who had been separate would become, in the eyes of the church and the law and every person in the castle, one thing. He did not think about it in these terms. He did not have a language for the philosophical dimension of what he was observing, but he felt something of it. The way you feel the significance of a moment, even without being able to articulate what significance is. He went back to brushing the horse. The morning continued to brighten. The kitchen produced smells that reached the stables on the morning air. Bread, the warm, sweet smell of bread baking. The smell that is older than written language and is associated in some part of the human brain that predates consciousness, with safety and warmth, and the presence of people who feed you. The smell of roasting meat, the smell of spices, the particular foreign sharpness of pepper and cinnamon and ginger, spices that came from distant places along trade routes that spanned the known world, that arrived in the castle kitchen as small dried things that would be ground and added to food to produce a flavour that said, without ambiguity, that the people eating this food had access to the world's luxuries. The stable boy smelled these things and was hungry. He would eat when there was time to eat. When the horses were done and the guests' needs were met and the stable was in order. He would eat bread and something and drink weak ale, and it would be enough because it was what there was. The sun was coming up, not yet visible from the stable. The angle of the castle walls blocked the direct light, but the sky above the walls was now the pale gold of early winter morning, and the courtyard was visible without a torch, and the faces of the people crossing it were recognizable, and the day had officially begun. He stepped out of the stables for a moment and stood in the courtyard. The morning air was cold and sharp, the kind of a cold that is invigorating rather than miserable. The cold of a clear winter day, not the cold of wet and grey, but the cold of sky and light, and the particular freshness that comes after a long night. He could see his breath. He could see the breath of the horses through the stable door behind him. The castle was awake around him, all of it, all its parts and people and animals and fires and food and ceremony and hierarchy, all of it moving toward the moment that would define this day. He was in it and not in it, part of it and adjacent to it. He had a job to do. He went back inside. The great wedding horses, the animals that would be seen by everyone, that would be part of the spectacle, were nearly ready. Their coats shone, their manes were braided, their feet were cleaned and oiled. They stood in their stalls with the particular dignity of animals that are physically well and recently groomed, animals in the condition that their nature is designed to achieve. He checked each one again, running his hands over each leg, each hoof, the way you check something you've already checked because the thing is important enough that one check is not sufficient. Everything was in order. He leaned against the doorway of the stable and watched the courtyard. The castle was fully awake now. The sounds of it were all the sounds it could make. Voices, footsteps, the clatter of the kitchen, the bells that marked the canonical hours, the particular sounds of a large number of people preparing for something together, all the individual sounds of individual tasks combining into a collective sound that was the sound of the institution functioning. In an hour, or perhaps less, the procession would form. In the chapel, the priest was already at work. The preparations for the ceremony, the arrangement of the altar, the particulars of the ritual that had been observed in some version or another for centuries before this morning, and would continue to be observed in some version or another for centuries after. In the bride's chamber, the last adjustments were being made, the final arrangement of the veil, the last pinning of the gown, the moment before the door opened that was the last moment of a particular kind of before married, before witness, before the formal assumption of a new identity. In the great hall, the tables were being laid. The food that had been days in preparation was being moved from the kitchen to the hall, a procession of serving dishes and platters and bowls that preceded the human procession and would be waiting when the ceremony was over. And in the stables, a boy of 13 leaned against the doorway and watched the morning light move across the stones of the courtyard. He had been awake all night. He was tired in the way that comes after a long night of work. Not the sharp tiredness of early fatigue, but the softer, slightly removed tiredness of someone who has moved past the worst of it and arrived at something that felt almost like wakefulness without quite being wakefulness. He had done his work. The horses were ready. Everything else would be done by other people, in other places, as it always had been and would continue to be. The ceremony would happen without him being in the chapel. The feast would happen without him being in the hall. The music would play, the vows would be spoken, the wine would flow, and the bread would be distributed, and the elaborate constructions of sugar and marzipan would be carried in, and admired, and consumed. He would be here, in the stables, where the work continued regardless of what happened in the more visible parts of the castle. Horses needed water at midday. Horses needed feed in the evening. There would be new horses arriving throughout the day, as guests who had not yet come made their late arrival. There would be departing horses from guests who stayed for the ceremony, but could not stay for the full celebration. The work did not stop for a wedding. He straightened up from the doorway and went back to his tasks. The morning moved forward, and in the courtyard, in the growing light of a cold medieval morning, the castle continued to be what it was, a place of hierarchy and labour and ceremony, and bodies and cold stone and firelight, a place where people of very different kinds shared the same walls and breathed the same air, and did the specific tasks that their position in the world required of them. The stable boy's task was the horses. He knew the horses. They knew him. In the world of the castle, where so much was formal and hierarchical and governed by rules that everyone understood, but no one had written down for him specifically, the relationship between a working boy and the animals in his care was one of the few relationships that was entirely functional, entirely honest, entirely without the complexity of rank and obligation. The horse did not care that he was a stable boy. The horse cared whether he was competent and kind and reliable, and he was. He had been trained to be, and he had practiced it until it was not a performance of competence, but simply competence, the unself-conscious mastery that comes from doing something until it is part of you. This was what he had to offer the day. Not a name that would be remembered, not a role in the ceremony, not a seat at the feast or a place in the procession. Just the work done well in the cold and the dark and the straw for the animals that needed it. And perhaps that is enough, not in the sense of a comforting moral, not in the sense of a consolation, but in the more literal sense that the work was actually enough, that it was what was needed, that without it the horses would not have been ready, and the procession would not have been as it was meant to be, and the day would have been diminished. The invisible labour of the unremembered people is not less real than the visible ceremonies of the powerful. It is the ground on which the ceremonies stand. It is the reason the spectacle is possible. The stable boy knew this in his way without knowing that he knew it. He knew it the way the body knows things, not as a thought, but as a practice, as a direction of daily movement, as the shape of a life. Outside, a trumpet sounded. The procession was forming. He listened to the trumpet from inside the stable, in the smell of horse and hay, in the cold that was slightly less cold than it had been an hour ago. The sound of the trumpet was clear and high and declarative, a sound designed to announce, to summon attention, to say that what was happening now was the thing that mattered. He stayed where he was. He had more work to do. The great day unfolded above him, in the chapel, in the hall, in the spaces where the powerful moved and spoke and promised and celebrated. It unfolded without him, as it is designed to do. The night that he had watched and worked through was over. The long waiting was resolved into the event it had been waiting for. And the stable boy, who had seen the night before the wedding from the only place he had ever stood, in the straw, in the dark, in the quiet company of animals who asked of him only that he show up and do what was needed, went about his morning. The horses drank. The castle celebrated, the cold continued, the light moved across the stone, and a boy who would leave no record of himself was there, in all of it, as real as anything that would be written down. He was there. That is the story, or rather, that is where the story ends, at the point where the ordinary day resumes and the extraordinary event begins, because the extraordinary event is the part we know, the part we've always known. It is the ordinary day, the long night before it, the cold hands and the straw and the horses and the boy who tended them. That is the part we have been missing. Sit for a moment with the image of the stable in the early morning, the light coming through the gap in the shutter, the breath of the horses visible in the cold air rising and dissipating, the smell of hay and animal warmth, the sound of the trumpet in the courtyard arriving through the stone walls, carrying its announcement into a space that does not stop its work for announcements, the boy standing at the door for a moment, listening, then turning back to what needed to be done. This is the texture of most lives, in most periods, in most places. The significant events are real, but they're surrounded by the continuous fabric of daily work and daily maintenance, and the small, essential tasks that hold the world together. The people who do that work are as present in history as the people who make the ceremonies. They are simply harder to see. We see the stable boy now, or we try to. And in trying to see him, we see something true about the medieval world. Not the world of tapestries and tournaments and great events, but the world of cold stone and cold hands and the long night that precedes every morning, regardless of what that morning will bring. Sleep now. The horses are settled. The night is over. The wedding will happen as it was meant to happen, and in the morning after the morning the stable will need to be cleaned, and the horses will need water, and the work will continue as it always does, as it has always done, as it will continue to do long after the names of the bride and groom have faded from common memory, and only the stones of the castle remain. The stable boy is asleep. The castle is at rest. The cold holds the walls the way cold has always held stone, and somewhere in the distance, very faint, the sound of music. Let it carry you down into sleep, but let us not leave the night so quickly. There is more to know about the world the stable boy inhabited, and the knowing of it is its own kind of slow pleasure. The play of understanding something fully, not just in outline, but in its particular texture, its particular smell and weight and difficulty. Let us go back to the stables, to the hour just before the trumpet sounded, and look more carefully at what was there. The stables of the medieval royal castle were not a uniform space. They were a collection of spaces that had grown over time, accumulated like the castle itself, added to when necessity required, modified when resources allowed, inherited in their current form by the people who used them without any single person having designed the whole. There was the main stable block, the primary structure, with its row of stalls along either side of a central passage. There were smaller attached structures, a covered area for storing tack, the leather harness and bits and stirrups and saddle pads that represented a significant investment in themselves and needed to be kept dry. There was a space for storing hay, elevated slightly from the floor to reduce the risk of damp, and another area for grain. Oats, primarily the preferred feed for horses that are expected to work. More energy-dense than hay, more expensive, rationed with care. The tack room deserves a moment of attention. The harness of medieval warhorse was a complex and expensive assemblage. The bridle alone, the headgear that went over the horse's head with its bit that sat in the horse's mouth and gave the rider directional control, might be made of leather decorated with metal fittings with embossed or stamped patterns, sometimes with the arms of the household worked into the design. The saddle was a structure of wood and leather that was fitted to the specific horse it belonged to, because horses have different back shapes, and a saddle that did not fit correctly was a saddle that would create pressure points, that would cause pain, that would eventually create open sores that could become infected and would render the horse unable to be ridden. The fitting of saddles was a specific skill, and the maintenance of saddles was a specific skill, and the cleaning of leather so that it did not dry and crack, and eventually fail was a specific skill. These were skills the stable boy had learned. The smell of leather oil, the rendered animal fat, sometimes mixed with beeswax, or other materials that was worked into the leather to keep it supple, was one of the constant smells of his working life, as familiar as the smell of the horses themselves. On the night before the wedding, some of the tack required for the procession had been laid out and checked and oiled for the final time. Not by the stable boy alone, but by the senior groom, an older man, a man who had been in the household for perhaps 2 decades, who had the kind of authority that comes not from title or rank, but from being the person who knows things that other people need to know. The senior groom's authority was practical and therefore absolute within its domain. He was not deferential to the stable boy, nor was the stable boy deferential to him in the way that a servant was deferential to a lord. Their relationship was simpler and more immediate. The senior groom knew more, and the stable boy knew this, and accepted it, and learned from it. The senior groom had checked the bridles and the saddles and the saddle pads and the stirrup leathers, and had made the adjustments he considered necessary and had pointed out quietly and without drama 2 places where the stable boy's work needed to be redone. The stable boy had redone it. Without argument, without resentment. Or rather, without expressed resentment, because the internal experience of being corrected is rarely entirely comfortable, even when the correction is fair. This was how knowledge was passed down in the medieval world. There were no manuals for stable work. There were no schools, obviously, in which the theory of horse management was taught. There was the accumulated practice of the people who had done this work before, passed on through demonstration and correction, and the long experience of working alongside someone who knew more than you. The senior groom had learned from the groom before him, who had learnt from the groom before him, stretching back through a chain of practical transmission that carried information about how horses worked and what they needed without ever writing it down. This is one of the great unwritten libraries of history. All the practical knowledge of the working world, all the accumulated skill and understanding of people whose work was done with their hands rather than their pens, knowledge that lived in bodies and was passed between bodies, and died when the body that held it died unless it had been passed on in time. The stable boy held some of this knowledge. Not all of it. He was 13 and knowledge takes time, but he held enough of it to do his work on this particular night, in this particular stable, with these particular horses without catastrophe. Let us think about the horses more specifically. The horses that would be most visible at the wedding were not random animals. They had been chosen, prepared, and trained for the purpose of ceremony. A horse in a procession needed to be not merely physically fit, but temperamentally suited to the conditions it would face. The crowd, the noise, the unusual environment, the pressure of many eyes, and the general heightened atmosphere of a large public event. Horses vary enormously in temperament. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological fact that was as well understood in the medieval period as it is now, even without the vocabulary we would use to describe it. Some horses are naturally calm, naturally inclined to accept unusual situations with equanimity, to stand still when asked to stand still and move forward when asked to move forward, without making a personal statement about the matter. These are the horses that end up in ceremonial roles. Other horses are more reactive. They are the horses that respond to unexpected sounds with a speed and athleticism that is, in the wrong context, alarming. They are the horses that decide on some internal basis that no human can fully predict, that a particular shadow or a particular smell or a particular arrangement of people is a threat requiring immediate evasive action. These horses have other virtues. They are often the fastest, the most athletic, the most useful in the hunt or, in times of war, in the controlled chaos of a cavalry engagement. But they are not the horses you put in a procession through a crowd of cheering people. The stable boy knew which horses were which. He knew this the way he knew everything about them, from direct experience, from hours of work in close proximity, from the accumulated sense of each individual animal's patterns and preferences and tendencies. He was not sentimental about the horses in the way that a modern person might be. The medieval relationship with animals was practical rather than sentimental. Animals were property, they had value. They needed to be cared for as valuable things needed to be cared for. But they were not companions in the modern sense, were not considered to have inner lives that mattered in themselves. The Church's position on animals and souls was clear, and the clarity of that position shaped the medieval understanding of what an animal was and was not. And yet, the hours spent in close proximity to any living creature creates something, even if that something does not have a name, even if the culture in which you live does not give you a vocabulary for it. The stable boy spent more time with these horses than with any human being in his life. He knew their individual voices, You're the particular sound each horse made, not just the category of horse sounds, but the specific inflections of specific animals. He knew which horses liked to have the area between their eyes stroked, and which ones found that intrusive. He knew which ones were calmer when they could see other horses, and which ones preferred to be partially isolated when they were anxious. This is knowledge of individuals. It may not have been philosophically acknowledged as such in the medieval world, but it was functionally equivalent to what a modern person would call knowing someone. He knew the dark mare with the slightly restless temperament who had been given the stall at the near end of the stable block, where she could see out into the courtyard and be distracted by the movement. He had given her that stall deliberately, not because anyone told him to, but because he understood from experience that she was better. She had something to look at. This was not a rule. It was judgment. It was a kind of practical intelligence that looks from the outside like instinct, but is actually accumulated observation applied to a specific situation. Let us leave the horses for a moment and think about the other living things in the castle on this night. A medieval castle was not only people and horses, it was a complete ecosystem of domestic and semi-domestic animals, each serving a function, each occupying a specific niche in the castle's economy. Dogs were everywhere. In the medieval period, dogs were working animals, not primarily pets, though the relationship between humans and dogs was already, even then, coloured by something beyond pure utility. There were hunting dogs of several different kinds, each bred and trained for a specific function in the hunt. The great hounds, the deerhounds, the wolfhounds, the hunting dogs that ran after large game, were large animals that moved through the castle with the confidence of things that understood their own importance. The smaller dogs, the terriers and ratters, had a different kind of importance. They were the castle's pest control, living between the walls, in the storage areas, in the spaces behind the kitchen where the grain was kept. Cats, too, for the same reason. The medieval cat was not the ambivalent indoor companion of modern urban life. It was a working animal, valued for its ability to reduce the population of the mice and rats that were a constant presence wherever food was stored. Cats in the medieval castle moved through the spaces between spaces, the dark corners, the attics, the undercrofts, doing their work without supervision and without much acknowledgement. They appeared at mealtimes in the kitchen and around the fireplaces in the evening, and they were tolerated and occasionally fed because their continued presence in the castle was beneficial, not because anyone had a sentimental investment in them. There were birds too, not the free birds of the courtyard and the battlements, though those were present as well, but the birds kept deliberately for specific purposes. Falcons and hawks were kept in the mews, a dedicated building or set of rooms whose name came from the word for molting, because the period of the birds' annual feather change was the period when they were most in need of careful management. The falcons and hawks were hunting animals trained over months and years to a precise collaboration with their human handlers, a collaboration that was the product of extraordinary patience and skill. They were among the most valuable animals in the castle. A trained peregrine falcon was worth more than many horses, and the falconers who trained and kept them were specialists, with a status that somewhat transcended their servant origins. On the night before the wedding, the mews would have been settled and quiet. The birds rested on their perches hooded. A small leather cap placed over the head was the primary tool for managing a hawk's anxiety, because a hooded bird cannot see, and therefore does not react to the visual stimuli that trigger the prey response, their talons gripping the perch with the automatic unconscious strength of a grip that did not require conscious maintenance. The falconer who managed them was one of those specialists who existed in the medieval household at the intersection of high status and practical labour. He handled birds that were worth more than he was in any financial reckoning. He possessed knowledge that was as rare and valuable as the birds themselves. He was, in the hierarchy of servants, significantly above the stable boy. He would have eaten better, slept better, had more agency over his time. But he was still a servant, still a person who existed to serve the needs of the household, rather than to pursue his own ends. This distinction between the person who serves and the person who is served is one of the fundamental organising principles of the medieval world. It shaped everything, from the architecture of the buildings to the arrangement of the dinner table, to the precise wording of the language people used to address each other. The medieval world was a world of ordered hierarchy, and the order was understood by everyone in it, not as an injustice to be overcome, but as a natural arrangement of things, sanctioned by God and maintained by custom and law. The stable boy did not resent his position in this hierarchy. This is not because he was incapable of resentment. Human beings are capable of resentment regardless of the historical period they inhabit. It is because the stable boy had grown up in this world, had never known another world, and therefore had no framework for imagining that the hierarchy could be otherwise. This is one of the ways in which the past is genuinely different from the present, not in the emotions it contains, but in the structures that give those emotions their direction. What did the stable boy want? This is a question that the historical record cannot answer, because the historical record did not ask it. But we can think about it. He probably wanted what most people in most periods want from their immediate circumstances: enough to eat, a tolerable place to sleep, work that he could do well and be recognized for doing well, relationships with the people around him that are functional and occasionally warm. These are not small wants. In a world where the harvest could fail and famine was a regular visitor, where illness could take a person of any age in a matter of days, where the structures of the world were capable of violence against the people in them, these were the wants that occupied most of the space of a life. Beyond those immediate wants, there might have been something else. A sense of the world as a place with further possibilities, curiosity about what existed beyond the castle walls, beyond the village, beyond the estate. The medieval world was not static. People moved. Goods moved. News moved. Ideas moved. A boy in a castle would have heard stories of other places from the guests who arrived from those places, from the merchants who came to sell things, from the travellers who passed through. The world was larger than the castle, and he might have known this and felt the weight of that knowledge. But speculation is speculation, and we should not project too much. The stable boy of the night before a royal wedding was a person fully in himself with his own inner life that we cannot access. What we can do is sit with that inaccessibility and let it be what it is, a reminder that the people of the past were not simplified versions of ourselves, not characters in a story designed for our understanding, but real people as complex and opaque as the people we knew in our own lives. Let us think about the night through one more frame before we release it. The castle in winter, at night before a wedding, was a place of extraordinary contrast. In the guest chambers, warmth and light and relative comfort. The lord's best linens, his best furniture, his household's best efforts at hospitality, all concentrated in the spaces where the powerful and the important would sleep and wake. The fires maintained through the night by servants who moved quietly through the corridors to add wood, to check the level of warmth, to anticipate the needs of the people who slept behind the closed doors. In the great hall, the tables laid for tomorrow's feast, the trestle set up, the boards placed on them, the tablecloths laid, the salt cellars positioned at the high table, where they carried their social weight and markers of status, the letter tables running down the sides of the hall where the lesser guests would sit, the rushes on the floor, the hangings on the walls, the candelabra that would be lit in the morning waiting in the darkness. In the kitchen, fire and work and the smell of food being prepared and stored and managed for the day ahead. The cook's domain, ordered according to the cook's internal map of what needed to be done and in what sequence, managed by a person who had spent a lifetime learning to manage it. In the stables, straw and horses, and a boy working in the light of a single lantern. All of these spaces existed simultaneously. All of them are real. All of them were the castle, not just the great hall and the guest chambers, not just the spaces where the ceremony would happen, and the feast would be held. The stables were as much the castle as the chapel. The stable boy's night was as much the night before the wedding as the bride's. The great events of history take place in specific material places, and those places are full of people whose relationship to the event is partial, oblique, practical, essential. The wedding was not possible without the stable boy. This is not a metaphor. The horses needed to be in the condition they were in on that morning, and they were in that condition because he had spent the night making sure of it. When we speak of history, we tend to speak in terms of the decisions of the powerful, the choice to form an alliance, the negotiation of terms, the ceremony that sealed the arrangement. But the decision to form the alliance was made by people who could move between castles, and the movement was made possible by horses, and the horses were tended by people who don't make decisions about alliances. The visible and the invisible are always connected. The powerful and the powerless exist in the same world and depend on each other in ways that the historical record doesn't make clear. The stable boy's night before the royal wedding is a thread in the tapestry of history. Pull it, and the tapestry changes. He is asleep now, finally. The dawn has passed into morning. The wedding has begun in the chapel above him, and the exhaustion of the long night has finally overtaken the alertness that kept him going. He's lying in the straw in the corner of the stable that is his place, his knees drawn up, his breath slow, the sounds of the castle above him and around him diminishing in his consciousness as sleep draws him down. The horses are calm, the tack is ready. The morning is cold and clear. The bells are ringing in the distance, and their sound reaches him through the stone and the straw and the last layer of wakefulness, and becomes part of the texture of a dream that we cannot see. He is sleeping. The castle continues. The wedding continues. The world continues in its way, the way it has always continued, the way it will continue. The powerful moving through their ceremonies, the invisible doing their work, the cold persisting in the walls, the fires persisting in the hearths, the animals breathing in the stalls, and somewhere in all of it, a boy at rest. That is enough. That is more than enough. Close your eyes. The straw is soft or soft enough. The horses breathe. The night is over. But perhaps we owe ourselves and him a little more time in the night. There is something we have not yet explored about the castle on that evening. Something that lives in the part of the building furthest from the stables, in the rooms of the women of the household were preparing, Not the bride, who had her own particular night, but the other women, the women whose labour surrounded and sustained the event without being acknowledged as part of it. The ladies-in-waiting of a medieval royal household were not merely decorative. This is important to understand, because the way we sometimes imagine these women, sitting in tapestried rooms doing embroidery, waiting for something to happen, is not entirely wrong but is deeply incomplete. The ladies-in-waiting were, among other things, the household's managers of a particular kind of domestic complexity. They supervised the care of the women they served. They managed information. They were the intermediaries between the private world of the women's quarters and the more public world of the hall and the court. On the night before a royal wedding, the senior lady-in-waiting was awake at midnight checking on the arrangements she had made. Her name, too, is lost. She was perhaps 35 years old, which in the medieval period was not middle-aged in the way we might think of it. It was, for a woman who had survived childbirth and disease and the ordinary hazards of the period, a demonstration of resilience rather than a marker of decline. She was experienced. She had been in this household for perhaps 20 years, had served through births and deaths and illnesses, and the ordinary conflicts of a large household that spends its life in close proximity. She had been managing the arrangements for this wedding for weeks. Her specific responsibility was the private world, the bride's chamber, the linens, the clothing, the food and drink that would be required in the women's quarters, the sequence of events that would take the bride from her chamber to the chapel. She had made lists in her head, if not on paper. Lists are a modern form requiring literacy and materials, and the management of a complex household in the medieval period was often done through memory and the particular kind of organisational intelligence that develops in people who have to hold many threads at once. She checked the bride's gown one more time. The gown was laid out on the large chest in the antechamber, where it would be kept safe and where it would be easiest to access in the morning. It had been unpacked from the chest in which it had travelled, inspected for damage, carefully pressed with heated stones wrapped in cloth that would smooth the fabric without burning it. The pressing of fine fabric was a skill in itself, requiring judgment about temperature and pressure, and the particular character of each different kind of textile. The gown was embroidered. This was expected. A bride of her rank did not appear in plain cloth. The embroidery covered the bodice and the cuffs and the hem, worked in silk thread in colours that had been chosen to complement the colour of the gown. A deep blue, embroidered with silver thread in a pattern of interlocking geometric shapes that is both stylish and symbolic. The symbolic dimension of the embroidery would have been understood by everyone who saw it. The patterns used in medieval textile work were rarely purely decorative. They carried meanings that were legible to the people of the time, meanings drawn from heraldry, from religious imagery, from the visual language of a culture that communicated a great deal through cloth. A border pattern of a specific kind might reference the bride's family arms. A central motif might carry religious meaning, invoking the protection of a particular saint or the blessing of the church on the marriage. All of this had been planned, commissioned, executed over months by the women who did such work. Some of the embroidery might have been done by the bride herself. Embroidery was a foundational skill for women of her rank, taught from childhood, practiced constantly, expressed in work that ranged from the purely domestic to the extraordinarily ambitious. The most elaborate pieces of medieval needlework represent hundreds of hours of concentrated female labour, work that required technical skill, aesthetic judgment, and the stamina to sustain fine, detailed work over long periods of time. The lady-in-waiting touched the edge of the gown gently, checking the seams for any sign that the thread had pulled or frayed during travel. Everything held. She moved on. The chamber was ready. The fire had been laid for the morning, and would be lit at first light by the first servant up. There were its personal effects. The combs, the small mirror, the bottles of rosewater and other preparations that formed part of the daily ritual of a noblewoman's appearance were arranged on the table beside the bed. The bed itself was made up with the best available linens, warmed by a bedpan filled with hot coals that had been placed between the sheets earlier in the evening and removed before they had cooled enough to risk scorching the fabric. She stepped out into the corridor and walked its length in the darkness, checking by feel rather than by sight, navigating by the knowledge of the space that lives not in the conscious mind but in the body, in the trained memory of a person who has moved through this corridor many times. The castle had its own sounds at this hour. Stone buildings settle continuously. The slight thermal contraction of night, the weight of the floors above, creating the barely perceptible movement that stone structures make throughout their lives. These sounds, which would alarm an unfamiliar person, were simply the background of the lady-in-waiting's experience. She had slept and woken in this castle for 2 decades, and the sounds of it were as much home to her as her own breath. She stopped at a window. The window was not glass. It was a narrow opening in the stone fitted with wooden shutters set into a wall that was more than a foot thick. Through the gap where the shutters met, a line of cold air came in, and with the cold air the sound of the courtyard, horses somewhere below, and the distant sound of someone moving, the scrape of a foot on stone or the clank of something metal against something stone. She had slept poorly the night before, and she expected to sleep poorly tonight. This was not distress. It was the state of a person who was managing something important, and whose mind, trained over years to maintain vigilance, could not fully release its grip on that vigilance even when the hour required rest. She was thinking about the morning sequence. The sequence was: the bride woke, was helped to rise, was taken to the small washing area where water for her morning ablutions had been prepared, was then dressed in the sequence that had been established and rehearsed. The undergown first, then the overdress, then the embroidered gown, then the veil. The veil was the final element, placed layered because it transformed the appearance most dramatically, and because placing it correctly required the room's best light. The timing of all this was delicate. The ceremony could not be moved. The priest's schedule was fixed. The guests' expectations were set. The hour had been established and would be observed. That meant the dressing needed to be completed within a specific window, which meant it needed to begin at a specific time, which meant the bride needed to wake at a specific time. The lady-in-waiting would wake first. She always did. Her body had learned over years to wake at the hour she needed it to wake. Not perfectly reliably, but reliably enough that she'd developed the complementary habit of lying awake in the minutes before the hour she needed, half waking, half waiting, before the internal clock delivered her into full consciousness. She moved back toward her room. Her own sleeping arrangements were not uncomfortable. She had a pallet in the antechamber of the bride's suite, a place that was private enough to allow sleep, but close enough that any significant sound from the bride's chamber would reach her. She lay down on top of the blankets in her clothes. She wouldn't sleep deeply. In the kitchen, the fires continued. The night cook, because in a household of this size in the days before a major event there was always someone in the kitchen, was a young man whose name would have been something common. something that appears in parish records and legal documents in such quantities that no individual bearing it can be confidently distinguished from any other. He was perhaps 18, an apprentice who had been learning his trade for 3 or 4 years, advanced enough in the hierarchy to be trusted with the night watch, but not yet advanced enough to have direct responsibility for the feast preparation. His work tonight was maintenance. He tended the fires, making sure they burned at the right level, high enough to maintain the temperature needed for certain items, low enough that they would not consume the remaining wood too quickly. He checked the things that needed to be checked. He tasted occasionally. A pot of stock that had been set on the embers to reduce slowly through the night needed to be tested at intervals to assess whether it was reducing properly, whether the flavour was concentrating as it should. The kitchen smelled at this hour of all the things that had been prepared during the day. The residual warmth of all that cooking, the sweetness of the spices that had been ground and used, the particular heavy smell of animal fat that had rendered during the long roasting of several large joints. The fat smell was not unpleasant. It was the smell of food, of preparation, of the work that sustained the household. He was not lonely in the kitchen. He had the fires for company, which sounds like a poetic exaggeration, but is not. The fires in a large kitchen were substantial, living things that required attention, and responded to that attention in ways that kept you engaged. There was always something to do. There was always some small intervention required. The fires demanded presence, and presence was what he had to offer. He would have heard distantly the sounds of the stable, the occasional sound of a horse, the sound of footsteps when the stable boy crossed the courtyard for water. He would not have thought much about the stable boy, probably. They were in the same castle, living the same night, doing similar work, maintenance, attention, the quiet labour of keeping things going until the main event began. But their paths did not cross during these dark hours. This is another thing the historical record obscures, the social topography of the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. We know in outline the social geography of the people at the top, who ranked above whom, who sat where at the table, who preceded whom through doors. We know much less about the social geography of the people at the bottom, who talked to whom, who was friendly with whom, which of the kitchen staff had a history with which of the stable staff, what the lines of affection and antipathy were among the people who lived and worked in close proximity without ever having their relationships recorded. The stable boy and the night cook were probably known to each other in the way that people who occupy the same institution are known to each other, recognizably without necessarily being close. They might have eaten meals together in the lower hall on ordinary days. They might have exchanged the particular kind of jokes that are only funny to people who share the specific frustrations of a specific kind of work. They might have had a friendship that was real, but that would never appear in any document. Outside the castle walls the village slept. The village that existed in the shadow of the castle. And most medieval castles existed in the shadow of a village, or the village existed in the shadow of the castle, depending on which came first, was a separate world with its own rhythms and its own concerns, but it was connected to the castle by threads of obligation and dependency that ran in both directions. The castle depended on the village for labour, for agricultural products, for the people who staffed its lower ranks. The village depended on the castle for protection, or rather for the idea of protection, for the legal and military structure that was supposed, in theory, to prevent the worst of what the world might do to an unprotected settlement. On the night before a royal wedding, the village knew something was happening. Wedding guests had been arriving for days, their horses and wagons passing through the village on the road that led to the castle gate. The villagers had watched the processions of important people with the particular attention of people who are accustomed to being bystanders to events that involve them only peripherally. Some of the villagers had found work connected to the wedding preparations, carrying extra supplies, providing additional firewood, performing tasks that the castle's own workforce was too stretched to accommodate. These were not permanent arrangements. They were the kind of temporary engagement that created a small windfall for the people involved and then ended, leaving things as they had been before. Others had simply watched and waited. Tomorrow they might be permitted to gather outside the castle to watch the procession pass, or they might not. Whether the common people of the village were welcome to observe the ceremony from the road was a matter of custom and the particular temperament of the lord. Some lords understood the value of visibility, of being seen by the people under their authority in moments of celebration, as a demonstration of their magnificence and their permanence. Others preferred their ceremonies private, their celebrations contained within the walls that defined their power. The village slept under a sky that the castle's lights did not reach. The stars above the village were as bright as the stars ever get in winter. The clear, cold nights of the season that favoured the visible stars before cloud and agricultural smoke obscured them. The particular map of the winter sky was as familiar to the villagers as the map of the fields they walked every day. They had no names for the stars that were both recognisable to a modern astronomer, or rather they had different names. The names of a cosmology that was organised around the Church's understanding of the heavens, rather than around the systematic observation that would produce modern astronomy several centuries later. But the stars were there. The same stars, the same light, the same cold and dark. The stable boy would have seen them too if he'd gone out to the well in the hours before dawn and looked up, as perhaps he did in one of those moments between tasks when the sky above a dark courtyard draws the eye upward. The sky above a medieval castle on a clear winter night, before the widespread use of artificial light, was a sky that no person in any major modern city has ever seen. The density of stars, the visibility of the Milky Way as a solid swath of light across the dome of the sky, the depth, the texture of the darkness between the stars. These were ordinary experiences for people who lived before the kind of light that now fills the modern night. They were not considered remarkable. They were simply the sky. We have lost this sky so completely that we cannot fully imagine it. We can know it intellectually, know that it was there, know what it looked like from descriptions and from the few dark places that still exist in the world. But the sensory knowledge, the knowledge of a body that has stood under such a sky and looked up and had the specific experience of so much visible light against so much visible dark, is not available to most of us. The stable boy had this sky. He probably did not think about it any more than we think about the quality of the air we breathe when we go outside in the morning. It was simply there, as ordinary and unremarkable as the stone of the courtyard underfoot, but was extraordinary, and we are allowed to note this, even if he did not. Let us come back inside. There is one more space in the castle that we should visit on this night before the wedding. A space that is neither the stables, nor the kitchen, nor the chambers of the guests, nor the women's quarters. A space that is neither working nor sleeping, neither below nor above. The chapel. The castle chapel was a small church. In the great royal castles, chapels could be significant structures, architecturally distinguished, decorated with paintings and carvings and coloured glass. In a smaller castle, the chapel might be a single modest room, set apart from the domestic spaces of the castle by its dedications and by the particular quality of silence that sacred spaces develop in cultures where the sacred is taken seriously. On the night before a wedding, the chapel would have had its own preparation. The priest had been working earlier in the day, not alone, but with the assistance of the chapel's altar servers, the young men or boys whose role it was to assist at the celebration of the Mass. The altar had been covered with its best cloth. The candles had been set in their holders. The incense had been prepared. The vessels used in the Mass, the chalice, the paten, the ciboriums, had been polished and set out. Sacred objects in the medieval period had a physical reality that was not merely symbolic. The chalice was not just a cup used to hold wine during a ceremony. It was an object that had been blessed, that had participated in the transformation that the Mass effected, that was imbued with a holiness that was understood as an actual quality of the thing, not merely a description of its function. The care taken with these objects, the polishing, the proper storage, the handling only by those authorized to handle them, was a care that respected their actual nature, not merely their symbolic role. The chapel was empty now. The candles were not lit. The altar was prepared and waiting. The light that came through the chapel windows, if there was glass, the coloured light of a stained window. If not, the clear darkness of a winter night through plain openings, was the light of the unlit chapel, the light before ceremony. There is something about a prepared and empty space that carries weight. A table set for a feast before the guests arrive, a stage before the performance begins, a chapel prepared for a ceremony that will happen in the morning. These are spaces in a state of anticipation, are held in readiness, waiting for the event that will fill them and transform them, and then leave them, eventually empty again. The castle priest had gone to his bed in the rooms adjacent to the chapel, the rooms that were his by virtue of his role, his specific domestic territory within the castle's larger domestic territory. He would need to be up early. The ceremony of morning prayer preceded the wedding ceremony. The proper ordering of the day's devotions required that the canonical hours be observed even on a day given over to celebration. He was, perhaps, the one person in the castle who was most likely to be at peace with the night. Not because he was without concerns. The specific demands of conducting a royal wedding ceremony were real and required careful attention, but because the theological framework through which he understood the world provided a context for those concerns that placed them within a larger order. The marriage he would solemnize in the morning was not merely a social arrangement. It was a sacrament, one of the 7 sacraments of the Church, a sacred act that bound the souls of the parties involved in a way that transcended the political and dynastic purposes it also served. For the priest, the night before a royal wedding was night within the frame of the sacred. The darkness and the preparation and the waiting all had meaning within that frame. The morning and the ceremony would have meaning. The marriage itself would have meaning. This is not a perspective that the stable boy shared, or not in the same way. His relationship to the church was the relationship of a medieval person of the lower orders, attendance at Mass on Sundays and feast days, the basic practice of a faith that was woven into the structure of the year and the structure of life without necessarily being experienced as a separate contemplative thing. The church bells that marked the canonical hours marked time for the stable boy in a practical sense. First light, mid-morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, rather than in a devotional one. But the faith was there, present in the background, shaping the understanding of the world in ways too pervasive to notice. The way the sky is present in the background of everything that happens under it. The night deepened and then began very slowly to lift. In the stable, the horses stood and breathed. In the kitchen, the fires continued their patient work. In the chapel, the darkness held the prepared Yalta. In the chambers of the guests, sleep of varying degrees of completeness. In the bride's anteroom, the lady-in-waiting lay in her clothes and monitored the darkness for signs of the approaching dawn. And in the corner of the stable, in the straw that were his place, the stable boy finally slept. He slept the way exhausted young people sleep when they finally allow themselves to stop. Thoroughly. Immediately. Without the slow negotiations with consciousness that adult sleep sometimes requires. He went from wakefulness to sleep with a directness that had no intermediate state. He dreamed, perhaps. We cannot know what he dreamed. The inner life of a medieval stable boy is not a document that was preserved. But his body rested and his breath slowed, and the horses around him in the darkness were calm, and the castle continued its night. This is the world we've been visiting. A world of cold stone and firelight and the smell of horses and the weight of a full bucket drawn up from a winter well, and the particular sound of a medieval castle in the deepest hours of the night. A world of hierarchy and labour and ceremony, and the invisible work that makes ceremony possible. A world where a boy of 13, who will leave no trace in the historical record beyond the general category of his work, was completely and entirely present, who was cold and tired and awake and eventually mercifully asleep, who tended horses, who did his work, who was there. We have been there with him. Now we can let the night finish, let the morning come, let the bells ring and the procession form and the ceremony proceed and the feast begin and the music play. Let the castle fill with everything that it was on this particular day, and let the stable boy sleep in his straw, in his corner, in the warmth of the breathing horses while the great day unfolds above him. He will wake when he is needed. He is always needed. Sleep